1868. Elias Blackwood, beast with a hobby of collecting human ears. On the morning of the 12th of June, 1868, in El Paso, Texas, the gallows cast its shadow over a crowd of more than 2,500 people who had come to witness the end of Elias Blackwood, a serial killer who had terrorized the frontier. In his death row cell, Elias, 38, calmly recounted 35 murders with details that made the court clerk tremble. The evidence at trial included 35 human ears, preserved in a salt-lined wooden box, which Elias had kept as trophies for a decade. Each ear told a story of calculated cruelty along the Rio Grande, where families had learned to bolt their doors at nightfall. What turned a respectable young cattleman into Texas's most feared highwayman remained a mystery until his final confession revealed truths the authorities had tried to conceal. If you're a fan of true crime and historical mysteries, subscribe to our channel and comment where you're listening from. The path that led Elias Blackwood to the gallows did not begin with violence, but with a simple act of self-preservation that would ultimately damn his soul forever. In the 1,850 seconds, the Texas frontier was a place where the law was a fragile thread. The vast desert stretching along the Rio Grande, with its spiny cacti and searing winds, formed a natural barrier between settled ranches and the endless wilderness. Rattlesnakes hid under rocks, and the dry air carried the distant howl of coyotes and the occasional growl of a cougar lurking in the shadows. The Blackwood family had settled here in 1845, when Elias was just 15. His father, Thomas Blackwood, had purchased 150 acres of arid land from a retired fur trapper. The property included a modest adobe ranch house, a stable, and a few weathered outbuildings. Thomas was known throughout the region as an honest man, one who kept his word and treated everyone fairly. His wife, Sarah, had died of malaria when Elias was young, leaving the boy to be raised by his father and an uncle named Harlan, a war veteran. The young Elias possessed an unusual combination of intelligence and physical strength. He could read and write better than most men twice his age, yet he could also lasso a wild steer or break a Mustang with remarkable skill. Neighbors often remarked that he had his late mother's intellect and his father's calloused hands. By 1852, when Elias was 22, he had become one of the most sought-after bachelors in the region. He stood 6'1", with brown hair and sharp gray eyes that seemed to see right through a person. The Rio Grande was both a lifeline and a thoroughfare for the scattered communities. Freight wagons brought supplies and news from San Antonio, while flatboats transported hides and silver downstream to trading markets. The river also attracted border bandits and outlaws, who used the vast desert as a hiding place between their crimes. Sheriff Josiah Kane, a former Texas Ranger, did his best to maintain order over more than 1,000 square miles of harsh terrain. In 1853, Elias met Isabella Moreno at a harvest festival in El Paso, the regional capital. Isabella was the daughter of Judge Antonio Moreno, one of the most influential men in West Texas. She possessed a rare beauty with jet-black hair and dark brown eyes that reflected intelligence and kindness. More importantly, she seemed genuinely interested in Elias despite their difference in social standing. Judge Moreno owned a vast ranch with hundreds of cattle and had extensive connections within the Texas government. Their courtship progressed in the customary fashion of the time. Elias would ride 20 miles to El Paso every Sunday after church, bringing wildflowers and spending carefully chaperoned hours with Isabella at the Moreno Ranch. The judge was initially reserved about his daughter courting a simple cattleman, but Elias's intelligence and obvious devotion to Isabella gradually won him over. By the spring of 1854, everyone was expecting an engagement announcement. The first sign of trouble appeared in May of that year, when a smuggler named Diego Ramirez went missing while traveling from Juarez to El Paso. Ramirez was believed to be carrying $1,200 in silver to purchase cattle near the Moreno Ranch. His horse was found wandering near the Rio Grande, but there was no sign of Ramirez himself. Sheriff Kane organized search parties that scoured the desert for days without success. The incident cast a pall over the entire community, a grim reminder of the dangers of the frontier. Elias Blackwood seemed particularly affected by Ramirez's disappearance. He joined every search party and spent long hours riding along the riverbanks, searching for any sign of the missing merchant. Isabella would later tell investigators that Elias had become increasingly morose and distracted during this period. He would often stare out into the desert during their conversations as if his mind were somewhere else. The truth of Diego Ramirez's fate would only be revealed in Elias Blackwood's final confessions 14 years later. But the events that unfolded on that May afternoon in 1854 would forever alter the young cattleman's destiny. In Blackwood's own words, spoken in a voice little more than a whisper as he sat chained in his death cell, the encounter began as a simple case of being in the wrong place at the wrong time. Blackwood was herding a stray calf along a remote canyon about 10 miles south of his father's ranch. The harsh afternoon sun still baked the earth when he heard the sound of an approaching horse through the red rocks. Diego Ramirez emerged from behind an outcropping, riding a black stallion and leading a mule laden with goods. The smuggler looked panicked, constantly glancing over his shoulder as if he feared pursuit. "Hey, boy," Ramirez called out, his voice thick with relief at finding another person in the desert. "I seem to have lost the trail. Can you point me toward El Paso?" Elias pointed east, toward a barely visible trail that wound through the hills. "Follow that dry creek bed for about 3 miles, then look for a saguaro cactus with 3 arms on your right. That trail will lead you back toward El Paso." Ramirez thanked him and was about to move on when his horse slipped on loose gravel, throwing him to the ground with a sickening crack. The merchant's left leg bent at an unnatural angle, clearly broken. His pained groan echoed through the canyon, startling a hawk into flight against the brilliant blue sky. Elias rushed to help, his natural instincts overriding all other considerations. As he knelt beside the injured man, Ramirez grabbed his arm with surprising strength. "Please," the merchant gasped, "don't leave me here. There are men after me. Bandits. They want my silver. They've been tracking me since Juarez." The young cattleman faced a terrible dilemma. Ramirez's leg needed immediate medical attention, but the nearest doctor was in El Paso, hours away across brutal desert terrain. Leaving the man alone would almost certainly mean his death, either from dehydration or from the pursuers he claimed were on his trail. Yet, getting him to safety through this rugged landscape was nearly impossible. As if summoned by Ramirez's fear, the sound of multiple horses galloping on stone reached their ears. Elias helped the merchant to his feet, supporting most of his weight as they stumbled toward a fissure in the rocks that might offer concealment. Through the gap, they watched as 3 menacing-looking men appeared in the harsh sunlight, their eyes scanning the canyon with predatory focus. The leader was a large man with a thick mustache and a long scar down his cheek. His companions were younger but no less dangerous, with the lean, hungry look of professional bandits. They dismounted and began examining the ground where Ramirez's horse had left tracks in the dusty earth. "The trail goes cold here," one of them said in a gravelly voice. "The mule probably ran off into the canyon." The mustached man shook his head. "Ramirez is too clever for that. He's hiding somewhere close." He raised his voice, addressing the barren canyon. "Come on out, Ramirez. We know you're here. Make it easy on yourself, and we'll make it quick." Elias felt Ramirez's body tremble against his as the 3 bandits fanned out along the dry creek bed. The merchant's breathing had become shallow and rapid, and blood was seeping through his torn trousers from the compound fracture. Delirious with pain, he began to mutter prayers in Spanish, his voice barely audible, yet far too loud for their precarious situation. One of the younger bandits froze, tilting his head like a hound catching a scent. "Hear that, Rufus? Sounds like someone's praying." The mustached leader, apparently named Rufus, drew a Colt revolver from its holster. The barrel glinted menacingly in the desert. "Sunday. Last chance to come out, Ramirez. Come out now, and we'll make it clean. Make us hunt for you, and we'll take our time." Elias Blackwood faced a choice that would haunt him for the rest of his life. He could stay hidden and watch these men torture and kill someone he had met by chance, or he could reveal himself and almost certainly share Ramirez's fate. The merchant's prayers grew louder as his pain intensified, and Elias knew their hiding place would be discovered within minutes. What happened next, according to Blackwood's confession, took place in a blur of violence that seemed to stretch for an eternity, but was over in seconds. As Rufus and his men closed in on their hiding place, Elias made his decision, but instead of revealing himself to save Ramirez, he clamped a hand over the merchant's mouth, cutting off both his prayer and his breath. Ramirez's eyes widened in horror as he realized what was happening, but his broken leg prevented any effective resistance. Elias held his hand there until Ramirez's struggles ceased, his own heart pounding so hard he was sure the bandits would hear it. The merchant's body went limp, and Elias gently laid him on the ground behind the rock fissure. He had chosen his own survival over the life of an innocent man, a choice that would echo through every subsequent crime he committed. The bandits searched for nearly another hour before giving up the hunt. As the sound of their hoofbeats faded into the desert heat, Elias Blackwood found himself alone with the corpse of Diego Ramirez and a terrible awareness of the man he had become. The merchant's lifeless eyes stared accusingly at the cloudless blue sky, and his mouth remained open in a silent scream of betrayal. But Elias's ordeal was not over. As he knelt beside the body, trying to process what he had done, his eyes fell on the leather saddlebags that had fallen from Ramirez's mule during the accident. One of them had burst open, spilling silver dollars across the parched earth. Elias counted over $1,200, more money than his family earned in 7 years of cattle ranching. The sight of that silver triggered something dark in Elias's mind. Ramirez was dead, killed by his own hand to ensure their mutual silence. The smuggler had no family in Texas. No one would come looking for him. The 3 bandits believed he had escaped, and the local authorities would assume he was either murdered by robbers or had perished from exposure in the desert. If Elias just disposed of the body and kept the silver, no one would ever know what had truly happened. Yet, even as these thoughts formed, Elias realized he faced a practical problem. Ramirez's body might eventually be discovered, and the broken leg would tell a story inconsistent with death by dehydration or animal attack. Furthermore, the merchant had a distinctive scar on his right ear, and his clothing was of a fine, easily recognizable Mexican make. Any investigation would eventually trace back to the last person seen in this area, which was Elias himself. It was then that Elias Blackwood committed his first deliberate act of mutilation. Using Ramirez's own knife, he carefully cut off the merchant's right ear, ensuring that identifying feature could never be traced back to its owner. The act sickened him, yet he found an almost relieving precision in the process. He wrapped the severed ear in a piece of cloth torn from Ramirez's shirt and put it in his pocket, though he couldn't explain why he chose to keep it. The rest of Ramirez's body was thrown into a deep crevasse and covered with rocks, where the buzzards would take care of any remaining evidence. Elias kept the silver, the knife, and that first severed ear. He told himself it was purely for practical purposes, a way to ensure his secret remained buried forever. But deep down, he knew something fundamental had shifted inside him. The transformation was not immediate. For several weeks after Ramirez's death, Elias went about his daily routine of ranching and courting Isabella Moreno. He used some of the silver to buy more cattle for his father's ranch, claiming he had won the money in a card game with some traders. Thomas Blackwood was pleased to see his son taking such initiative, never suspecting the money had been bought with blood. Isabella noticed the changes in Elias's behavior, subtle at first, but more pronounced as the months passed. He became more possessive of her time and attention, less willing to tolerate the presence of other suitors who might call on her. His eyes, once sparkling with warmth and humor, now held a coldness that unsettled her. When she mentioned these concerns to her father, Judge Moreno dismissed them as the natural jealousy of a young man in love. The second murder occurred in October 1854, just 5 months after the death of Ramirez. This time, the victim was an itinerant preacher named Elijah Hawthorne, who traveled the Texas frontier spreading the gospel. Hawthorne was known to carry significant donations from his followers, money intended for the construction of an orphanage in San Antonio. According to Blackwood's confession, he had no plan to kill Reverend Hawthorne. The preacher's death was the result of what Elias described as an opportunity that presented itself. Hawthorne had stopped at the Blackwood ranch to ask for water and to rest for the night. Thomas Blackwood was honored to host a man of God, and the evening passed pleasantly with Bible readings and discussions of spiritual matters. As Hawthorne prepared to leave the next morning, he made a fatal mistake. He told Elias he was carrying over $500 in donations and asked for the safest route towards San Antonio. The preacher's trusting nature and apparent wealth triggered the same dark impulses that had led to Ramirez's death. Elias volunteered to guide Hawthorne through the desert to the main road, claiming to know shortcuts that would save the preacher several hours of travel. Thomas Blackwood blessed their journey and watched them disappear into the morning heat, never suspecting he would never see Reverend Hawthorne alive again. The murder took place at a remote oasis, where an old Apache trail intersected with a dry creek. Elias struck the preacher from behind with a heavy oak limb, then finished him with Ramirez's knife, while Hawthorne lay unconscious on the ground. This time, the act felt easier, more natural. The disgust he had experienced with Ramirez was replaced by a cold efficiency that bewildered him even as he embraced it. Before disposing of Hawthorne's body, Elias cut off the preacher's left ear, adding it to the cloth bundle he had carried since Ramirez's death. He told himself it was still for the purpose of preventing identification, but the truth was more complex. The ears had become trophies, tangible reminders of his power over life and death. News of Reverend Hawthorne's disappearance spread through West Texas like wildfire. Unlike Diego Ramirez, a little-known smuggler, the preacher was widely known and beloved. Communities in 3 counties organized search parties, and even the state government offered a reward for information about his fate. Sheriff Josiah Kane found himself under intense pressure to solve the case, especially from church leaders demanding justice for their fallen brother. Elias Blackwood joined the searches with apparent enthusiasm, volunteering countless hours to scour the desert and canyons for any sign of the missing preacher. His dedication impressed everyone, including Isabella Moreno, who praised his selflessness in helping to find a man of God. Thomas Blackwood was proud of his son's community spirit, never imagining that Elias knew exactly where Reverend Hawthorne's remains were being picked clean by scavengers in a deep desert ravine. The investigation took an unexpected turn when Kane discovered that both Ramirez and Hawthorne had been carrying significant amounts of money at the time of their disappearances. The sheriff began to suspect that a band of robbers was operating in the area, targeting wealthy travelers who used the desert trails. He sent notices to the rangers and authorities in neighboring counties, warning them to be on the lookout for similar crimes. This development worried Elias more than he dared to admit. 2 disappearances could be a coincidence, but a pattern would inevitably draw unwanted attention to anyone who had been in the area during both incidents. He needed to be more careful, to space out his activities, and to choose victims who were less likely to be missed. The 3rd murder occurred in February 1855, and this time, Elias had learned from his previous experiences. His victim was a gunrunner named Harlan Voss, a man whose profession made him widely despised in the region. Voss was traveling south from Santa Fe with a caravan of 20 miners he had hired to protect his shipment of illegal arms. He had stopped near the Blackwood ranch to repair a broken wagon wheel. Thomas Blackwood was uncomfortable with Voss's presence, but frontier hospitality demanded that he offer overnight accommodation. The gunrunner was a crude, violent man who treated his hired hands with casual cruelty. He boasted loudly of the profits he would make in Mexico and flashed a money belt containing over $700 and a silver medallion. Elias observed Voss's behavior with growing disgust, but his moral outrage was mixed with the now familiar hunger for the man's wealth. When Voss announced his intention to leave before dawn to avoid the heat of the day, Elias volunteered to show him a shortcut through the desert that would save several miles of difficult travel. The murder of Harlan Voss was the most brutal yet. Elias had grown more confident in his abilities, and he took his time with the gunrunner, subjecting him to a terrifying ordeal before finally ending his life. He cut off Voss's right ear and added it to his growing collection, but this time he also took the man's silver medallion, which he ripped from the corpse's jacket. The 20 miners who had witnessed Voss leave with Elias posed a serious problem. They had seen the young cattleman lead their employer into the desert, and their testimony could eventually lead investigators back to the Blackwood ranch. Elias dealt with this problem with characteristic ruthlessness, leading the bewildered and terrified men deeper into the desert and then abandoning them without food, water, or knowledge of the local geography. Most of the abandoned miners perished within days, victims of the elements, predators, and the unforgiving Texas terrain. A few managed to find their way to safety, but they were quickly rounded up by bounty hunters and charged with desertion. Their stories of Voss's disappearance were dismissed as attempts to evade consequences, By 1856, Elias Blackwood had killed 8 people and accumulated nearly $4,000 in stolen money. His collection of human ears had grown, including trophies from each victim, carefully preserved in salt and stored in a wooden box he kept hidden beneath the floorboards of his bedroom. The methodical nature of the mutilations had evolved from practical necessity into a ritualistic obsession. The murders had also attracted the attention of Rufus Cain, the mustached bandit whose pursuit of Diego Ramirez had indirectly led to Elias's first killing. Cain was the leader of a loosely organized gang of robbers and murderers who operated throughout the Texas-Mexico border region. He had been following reports of the disappearances with professional interest, recognizing the work of someone who could be useful to his organization. Cain made contact with Elias through a series of carefully arranged meetings, each designed to test the young cattleman's trustworthiness and ruthlessness. The bandit leader was impressed by Elias's intelligence and his ability to deflect suspicion from himself, but he was particularly intrigued by the rumors of mutilation that had begun to circulate in the criminal underworld. The partnership that developed between Blackwood and Cain's gang would terrorize the Rio Grande Valley for the next 2 years. Elias provided local knowledge and a legitimate cover for the gang's operations, while Cain provided protection and access to more lucrative targets. The human ears became Elias's signature, a calling card that struck fear into the hearts of potential victims and marked him as a killer to be respected in criminal circles. Isabella Marino began to notice more disturbing changes in her fiancé's behavior during this period. Elias had officially proposed in the spring of 1855, and Judge Marino had given his blessing to the union. The wedding was planned for the following autumn, but Isabella found herself increasingly unnerved by the man she had agreed to marry. Elias's eyes had developed a predatory gleam, reminding her of the way coyotes watched rabbits before they pounced. He spoke less, but with greater intensity, and his conversations often turned to topics of violence and death that seemed inappropriate for a respectable cattleman. Most alarmingly, he had begun to collect revolvers and other weapons, claiming they were necessary tools for protecting the ranch, but cleaning and admiring them with an enthusiasm that seemed excessive. The turning point came in July 1856, when Elias and Cain's gang attacked a stagecoach known as the Desert Rose as it was traveling toward El Paso. The stagecoach carried 15 passengers, including 3 families with young children, and its wagons were laden with silver and valuable merchandise destined for the region's merchants. The attack was meticulously planned and executed with military precision. Elias had scouted the stagecoach's route and identified the best location for an ambush, a narrow canyon where the trail forced the wagons into a single-file line. Cain's men attacked from the canyon ridges, overwhelming the few guards before they could mount an effective resistance. What followed was a massacre that shocked even hardened criminals. The gang systematically robbed and murdered everyone in the Desert Rose caravan, showing no mercy for age or gender. Elias personally killed 4 of the passengers, including a young father who was taking his family to California to start a new life. He took the man's ear as a trophy, along with his silver pocket watch and wedding ring. The Desert Rose incident marked a turning point in the gang's operations and in Elias Blackwood's psychological development. The mass murder provoked a massive public outcry and brought the Texas Rangers and federal authorities into the investigation. More importantly, it had satisfied something deep and dark within Elias, confirming his transformation from a reluctant killer into an enthusiastic predator. Just when we thought we had seen the extent of Elias Blackwood's depravity, the horror in the Rio Grande Valley intensified. If this story is sending shivers down your spine, share this video with a friend who loves dark mysteries. Hit the like button to support our content, and don't forget to subscribe so you never miss stories like this one. Let's find out together what happens next in this tale of one man's descent into madness. The discovery of the burned-out remains of the Desert Rose caravan 3 days later sent shockwaves across Texas. Federal marshals arrived from Austin to coordinate the investigation, and the state legislature authorized a special fund for a reward for the capture of those responsible. Sheriff Cain found himself working alongside investigators who possessed resources and expertise far beyond anything available in this remote frontier region. The increased scrutiny forced Elias to be more careful in his personal life. He maintained the facade of a devoted fiancé and a dutiful son, But the strain of living a double life was taking its toll. Isabella noticed that he had begun to talk in his sleep, muttering words she couldn't understand, and sometimes crying out as if in pain. When she asked him about these nightly disturbances, he brushed them off as anxiety over their upcoming wedding. Thomas Blackwood also observed changes in his son's behavior, though he attributed them to the natural stress of a young man preparing to marry and take on greater responsibilities. Elias had become more withdrawn and irritable, spending long hours away from home on trips he claimed were for cattle trading to earn extra money for the wedding. The elder Blackwood was pleased by his son's initiative, never suspecting that these absences coincided with other murders in the region. The confession that would ultimately lead Elias Blackwood to the gallows began on the 28th of May 1868 in the death row cell of the El Paso County Jail. Sheriff Josiah Kane had been interrogating Blackwood for weeks, using every questioning technique he had learned in 30 years as a Texas Ranger and lawman. The outlaw had remained stubbornly silent about the details of his crimes, responding to questions only with cold stares and occasional grunts of acknowledgement. Kane had tried everything: appeals to conscience, promises of leniency in exchange for cooperation, even threats of additional charges. Elias Blackwood sat on his narrow cot, like a statue carved from sandstone, his sharp gray eyes revealing none of the horrors locked away in his memory. The sheriff had begun to despair of ever learning the full truth of the Rio Grande murders, when fate provided an unexpected key to breaking the killer's silence. The breakthrough came when Kane mentioned that Isabella Moreno, now Isabella Delgado after marrying a wealthy San Antonio rancher, had agreed to testify about Elias's strange behavior in the months before they called off their engagement. The sheriff intended this only as another piece of evidence to present at trial, but he noticed an immediate change in the prisoner's demeanor when her name was mentioned. The mention of Isabella's name seemed to shatter something fundamental inside Elias Blackwood. His rigid posture sagged, and his hands, which had remained steady through weeks of interrogation, began to tremble uncontrollably. For the first time since his capture, tears began to stream down his sun-beaten cheeks, leaving clean tracks through the accumulated grime of his confinement. "Isabella," he whispered, the name escaping his lips like a prayer in a forgotten language. "Beautiful, gentle Isabella. Does she know what I've become?" Sheriff Kane recognized the moment and carefully modulated his voice to match Elias's low tone. "She knows you've been arrested, Elias. She knows about the charges, but she doesn't know the details. Not yet. She might still remember you as the young cattleman she once loved. If you help us understand what happened to that man." Elias's voice, when he finally began to speak in earnest, was almost inaudible, forcing Kane to press close to the cell bars to hear the words that would reveal the true scale of the Rio Grande murders. The sheriff had prepared for this moment by bringing extra paper and ink, but nothing could have prepared him for the magnitude of the confessions that would pour out over the next 3 days. "I loved her," Elias whispered, his hands gripping the bars with such force that his knuckles turned white. "Everything I did, every choice I made in those early days, was to become worthy of her love. I wanted to be more than just a simple cattleman scratching a living out of the Texas dust. I wanted to give her the life she deserved, the life her father's wealth could provide, but which my honest labor never could." The confession that followed lasted for 3 days and filled nearly 250 pages of Kane's careful script. Elias Blackwood described 35 separate murders committed between 1854 and 1867. Each was recounted with chilling precision and attention to detail, revealing both his intelligence and his complete moral depravity. He began with Diego Ramirez, describing not only the murder itself, but also the internal struggle that preceded it. "I put my hand over his mouth and felt his life drain away beneath my palm," Elias said, his voice growing distant as he relived the moment. "In that instant, I understood something about myself that I had never known before. I had the power to choose who lived and who died, and that power was more intoxicating than any whiskey or card game." Elias explained his system of taking human ears as trophies, describing how the practice had evolved from practical necessity into a complex ritual. Initially, he had cut the ears to prevent the identification of bodies, but the severed ears had gradually become symbols of his dominance over his victims. He categorized them according to the circumstances of each death, developing an increasingly elaborate taxonomy of murder that reflected his systematic approach to killing. Each ear tells a story, he explained to the horrified sheriff. This one belonged to a smuggler who begged for his life until the very end. This one came from a preacher who cursed me with his dying breath. This one was taken from a man who fought like a cougar to defend his family before I silenced him forever. The most shocking revelation came when Elias led Sheriff Kane and a team of Texas Rangers to a hidden cave along the Rio Grande, where he had stored his gruesome collection. The cave was located in a remote canyon, accessible only by climbing down a steep cliff face, surrounded by cacti and red rock that formed a natural cathedral of darkness and silence. Inside the cave, investigators found not only the wooden box containing the 5 preserved human ears, but also a treasure trove of evidence that painted a complete picture of Elias Blackwood's criminal career. He had kept detailed journals of each murder, including sketches of his victims, maps marking the locations of their deaths, and meticulous notes on their last words, along with the amount of money or valuables taken from their bodies. The cave also contained the personal effects of each victim, jewelry, pocket watches, silver crosses, family photographs, and other mementos that Elias had collected as secondary trophies. Most disturbingly, there was a series of leather-bound diaries in which he had chronicled his thoughts and feelings about each killing, describing his emotional state during the murders and analyzing his techniques for future improvement. "I studied my craft as other men study medicine or law," Elias told Kane as they examined the contents of the cave. "I read every account of famous robberies I could find, looking for techniques I could adopt or improve upon. I experimented with different methods of killing, calculating the timing of my victims' deaths to maximize their suffering while minimizing my risk of detection." One diary contained detailed observations on the psychology of his victims, noting how different types of people reacted to the realization that they were about to die. Elias had categorized these reactions and developed specific approaches for dealing with each type, treating murder as a scientific discipline that could be perfected through careful study and practice. The Texas Ranger Captain, Ben Carter, who was assigned to coordinate the multi-county investigation, described the cave as a monument to an evil beyond anything in my 30 years of law enforcement. The methodical nature of Elias's record-keeping provided investigators with a roadmap to dozens of unsolved murders throughout the Texas frontier, cases that had baffled local authorities for years. But the true horror of Elias Blackwood's crimes went far beyond the numbers or even the bizarre collection of trophies. His confession revealed a systematic campaign of terror that had traumatized an entire region for more than a decade. Families had lived in constant fear, caravans had avoided the trails near the Rio Grande, and entire communities had been transformed by the knowledge that a monster was walking among them. The psychological profile that emerged from Elias's confession painted a picture of a man who had gradually shed his humanity in pursuit of wealth and power, yet had retained enough intelligence and social awareness to maintain the facade of a respectable citizen. He described the evolution of his killing methods with the cold precision of a craftsman discussing his trade, showing no remorse for his actions, but rather a professional pride in his efficiency and success. "I became what I needed to be," he told Kane during one particularly intense interrogation session. "This land creates its own monsters by offering rewards that honest men cannot achieve by honest means. I simply had the courage to take what I wanted, instead of accepting the limits that others impose on themselves." The testimony of Isabella Moreno Delgado, given in a closed session to spare her the ordeal of a public trial, provided crucial insight into Elias's deteriorating mental state during the most intense period of his criminal activity. She described the subtle changes in his behavior that had begun even before their engagement, changes she had attributed to the normal stresses of courtship and preparation for marriage. He began to speak differently about other people. She told the court through tears she struggled to control. Where he had once shown compassion for the unfortunate, he began to express contempt for those he considered weak or foolish. He spoke of poor miners as if they deserved their fate, and of wealthy ranchers as if their success proved their superiority over others. Isabella also described the nightmares that had plagued her for years after calling off the engagement. Dreams in which Elias appeared as a creature of shadow and blood who whispered her name in the voice of the dead. These dreams were so vivid and disturbing that she had consulted priests and even a specialist in nervous disorders. but nothing could quiet the recurring visions. Most damning was her memory of a conversation they had had in the summer of 1856, just a few months before she ended their engagement. Elias had been describing his plans for their future, speaking of the wealth he would accumulate and the status they would achieve in Texas society. When Isabella asked him how he planned to accomplish these goals so quickly, he had smiled in a way that chilled her blood. "He told me that there were opportunities everywhere for those bold enough to seize them," she testified. "He said that successful men understood that the world belonged to those strong enough to take what they wanted, regardless of the methods required. I thought at the time that he was speaking metaphorically about business competition, but I now understand that he was describing a philosophy that had led him to murder." The trial of Elias Blackwood became a sensation throughout the West, with newspapers from San Francisco to St. Louis carrying daily reports of the proceedings. The courtroom was packed with spectators, including family members of the identified victims and curious onlookers drawn by the lurid details of the case. Hotels in El Paso were booked for weeks as people traveled from hundreds of miles away to witness what many considered the trial of the century. Judge Theodore Grant, a veteran of some of Texas's most notorious criminal trials, described the Blackwood case as the most disturbing he had ever encountered. A dignified man in his 60 seconds who had presided over everything from gunfights to political corruption cases, Grant found himself genuinely shaken by the evidence presented in his courtroom. In 35 years on the bench, he told colleagues privately, "I have never encountered an evil so calculated." This man destroyed lives not from passion or desperation, but from a cold calculation that human beings were mere obstacles to his ambition. He represents a type of criminal our legal system was never designed to address. The defense attorney, a young lawyer named Franklin Pierce, who was appointed by the court when no experienced counsel would take the case, was tempted to argue that his client was insane and therefore not responsible for his actions. Pierce brought in doctors from as far away as New Orleans to testify about Elias's mental state, presenting theories of desert-induced madness and innate criminal predispositions, which were the cutting edge of medical science at the time. Dr. Alistair Finch, a prominent physician from the New Orleans asylum, testified that Elias exhibited symptoms of what he called environmentally induced moral deficiency, a condition in which the patient possessed normal intellectual faculties but lacked the emotional capacity for empathy or guilt due to the harshness of their environment. Finch argued that such individuals could not be held fully accountable for their actions because they were incapable of understanding the moral dimensions of their behavior. The insanity defense, however, was undermined by the methodical nature of the crimes and the clear planning that went into each murder. The prosecution effectively argued that Elias's detailed records and systematic approach to killing demonstrated a clear awareness of right and wrong, even if he chose to ignore moral constraints in pursuit of his goals. Elias himself refused to cooperate with the insanity defense, insisting that he was fully aware of his actions and accepted responsibility for every death. His calm demeanor during the trial unnerved the spectators and seemed to support the prosecution's argument that he was a calculated killer, undeserving of the court's mercy. "I am not mad," he declared during one of the few times he spoke in his own defense. "I made conscious choices based on rational calculations of my own self-interest. If that makes me a monster, then so be it. But do not diminish my crimes by pretending that I was not fully aware of their consequences." The prosecution was led by District Attorney Charles Dutton, an ambitious politician who had built his career on high-profile criminal cases and recognized that the Blackwood trial could establish his reputation as one of the West's leading legal minds. Dutton had spent months preparing for the case, consulting with experts from across the country and developing a presentation that would methodically demonstrate the scale of Elias's crimes. Dutton systematically presented the evidence linking Elias to dozens of unsolved murders in the region, using the collection of human ears and the written confessions to build an undeniable case. He painted a picture of a predator who had masqueraded as a respectable member of the community while systematically murdering innocent people for profit, describing each crime in enough detail to horrify the jury while stopping short of the most gruesome elements that might have caused a mistrial. The prosecutor's closing argument lasted nearly 4 hours and was considered a masterpiece of legal oratory. Dutton traced Elias's transformation from a promising young cattleman to an unrepentant killer, arguing that the defendant had made a series of conscious choices that led him inevitably to the gallows. He dismissed the defense's claims of insanity, pointing to the detailed planning and careful execution of the crimes as evidence of a malicious, not a diseased mind. "Gentlemen of the jury," Dutton concluded, his voice ringing through the packed courtroom, "you have heard evidence of crimes so monstrous they challenge our belief in human nature. Elias Blackwood sits before you not as a victim of circumstance or disease, but as a man who chose evil with full awareness of its consequences. He murdered 35 innocent people, not from madness or desperation, but from a cold calculation that their lives were less important than his desire for wealth." The jury deliberated for less than an hour before returning a verdict of guilty on all counts. The jury foreman, a wealthy rancher named Walter Reed, later described the deliberation as one of the easiest decisions he had ever made. "The evidence was overwhelming," he told reporters. "We spent most of our time discussing whether we had any choice but to recommend the death penalty, and we concluded that justice demanded nothing less than the ultimate punishment." Judge Grant sentenced Elias Blackwood to death by hanging, to be carried out on the 12th of June, 1868. The condemned man received his sentence with the same calm composure he had maintained throughout the trial, nodding slightly as if the verdict confirmed something he had already accepted. When asked if he had any final words for the court, Elias stood slowly and addressed the packed courtroom in a clear, steady voice. "I have received the justice I deserve," he said, his eyes scanning the faces in the audience. "I ask for no mercy, nor do I claim innocence of the crimes for which I have been convicted. I hope that my fate will serve as a warning to any who might be tempted to follow the path I have chosen. No treasure is worth a man's soul." Elias spent his final weeks in the El Paso County Jail, working with Sheriff Kane to identify additional victims and bring closure to families who had lost loved ones to his killing spree. His cooperation led to the discovery of several more sets of remains and helped to solve disappearances that had puzzled investigators for years. He drew detailed maps indicating the locations of burial sites and provided descriptions that allowed search teams to find remains that had been hidden for more than a decade. Some observers suggested that Elias was seeking redemption through these final acts of honesty, but Sheriff Kane believed the condemned man was simply enjoying the opportunity to relive his crimes one last time. He described each murder with the enthusiasm other men might show when recounting their greatest accomplishments. Kane later wrote in his memoirs, "I came to understand that killing had given his life meaning and purpose, and helping us solve these cases allowed him to feel important and relevant again." The process of victim identification and recovery of remains continued almost until the day of the execution. Elias led investigators to burial sites throughout West Texas, revealing a network of hidden graves that testified to the true scale of his criminal career. In several cases, he had murdered entire families and buried them together in mass graves, carefully concealed under large rock formations or in shallow caves. One of the most disturbing discoveries came when Elias led search teams to a site near the Mexican border, where he had buried 5 members of the Schmidt family, including 3 children aged 4 to 12. The Schmidts were German immigrants traveling to California when they encountered Elias on a remote stretch of trail. He had killed them all for the modest sum of $60 and a small music box. "I told them I was a guide heading west," Elias recalled with what seemed to be genuine fondness for the memory. "They invited me to share their campfire and their meal, trusting in my friendly appearance until the moment I shot them. The children didn't even understand what was happening to them." Isabella Moreno Delgado never saw Elias again after their engagement was broken in 1856, but she sent a letter to the prison chaplain expressing her forgiveness for the man she had once loved. The letter arrived 3 days before the scheduled execution and was delivered to Elias by Father Miguel, who had been providing spiritual counsel to the condemned man. The letter was brief but deeply moving, written in Isabella's careful script on paper that still smelled faintly of the lavender she favored. She wrote that she had spent 12 years trying to understand how the gentle young man she had known could have become the monster described in the newspapers, and that she had finally found peace through prayer and forgiveness. I choose to remember the Elias Blackwood who brought me blooming cactus flowers and spoke of his dreams for our future, she wrote. That man existed, if only for a short time, and I believe that somewhere deep inside the person you have become, a part of that good man still remains. I pray that you will find him again before you face your final judgment. The letter was read to Elias on the eve of his execution, and witnesses reported that he wept openly upon hearing her words. The prison chaplain later described it as the only time he saw the condemned man show genuine emotion, though he remained unsure whether Elias's tears reflected remorse for his crimes or simply grief for the life he had lost through his own choices. Elias dictated a reply to Isabella, a rambling 10-page confession that took nearly 2 hours to complete. In it, he apologized for the pain he had caused her and asked her to remember the young cattleman she had known instead of the monster he had become. He also revealed that thoughts of her had haunted him throughout his criminal career and that he had often imagined what their life might have been like if he had chosen a different path. "You were the angel I never deserved to touch," he dictated to Father Miguel. "With every life I took, I moved further from the light you represented and deeper into the darkness that ultimately consumed me. If there is any justice in this world, you will forget that Elias Blackwood ever existed and live the happy life that my choices made impossible." Thomas Blackwood visited his son twice in his final weeks, conversations that left the old man broken and confused. He could not reconcile the gentle boy he had raised with the calculated killer sitting in chains in the death cell, and each visit seemed to age him by years. The elder Blackwood's health had been failing since Elias's arrest, and the strain of the trial and subsequent revelations had accelerated his decline. During their final meeting, Thomas pleaded with his son to explain how things had gone so wrong, to help him understand where he had failed as a father. Elias seemed genuinely moved by his father's pain and spent more than an hour trying to offer some explanation that might ease the old man's suffering. "You did nothing wrong, Father," Elias told him. "You raised me with love and taught me right from wrong as clearly as any man could. The choices I made were my own, and the responsibility for my crimes belongs to no one but me. Do not carry the burden of my guilt along with your own grief." But Thomas Blackwood could find no peace in his son's words. He died less than a year after the execution, and local people believed he had been broken by the shame and grief of his son's crimes. His ranch was eventually sold to pay off debts, and the new owners tore down the old adobe house where Elias had been raised, claiming that no decent family could live in a place where such evil had been nurtured. On the morning of the execution, Elias Blackwood was awakened at dawn by the sound of the crowd gathering outside the jail. More than 2,500 people had come to El Paso to witness the hanging, including many who had been camping outside the town for days to ensure they could get a good viewing spot. Vendors sold food and souvenirs to the crowd, and several photographers had set up their equipment to capture images of the historic event. Elias ate a final breakfast of eggs, bacon, and coffee, enjoying the meal with apparent relish, while Father Miguel read passages from the Bible. He had not requested a special last meal, saying that simple fare suited his mood better than fancy dishes. When asked if he had any regrets about his life, he considered the question for several minutes before answering. "I regret the pain I caused to those who loved me," he said finally. "I regret that I wasted the gifts God gave me and used them for evil instead of good. But I do not regret the choices that brought me to this place, for they were made by a man who was fully aware of their consequences. To regret them now would be to deny the very nature of the man I became." At 10 a.m., Elias was escorted to the gallows by Sheriff Kane and 2 Texas Rangers. He had refused the traditional black hood, preferring to face his death with his eyes open, and he mounted the scaffold with a steady stride that showed no sign of fear or hesitation. The crowd fell silent as he climbed the 13 steps to the platform, and even the vendors stopped their hawking to watch the final moments of one of the most notorious criminals in Western history. Elias was given the opportunity to address the crowd, a tradition he accepted with apparent gratitude. He stepped forward to the edge of the platform and spoke in a clear, strong voice that carried across the sea of upturned faces below. "I have confessed my crimes and accepted my punishment," he said, his hands steady despite their manacles. "Let my death serve as a warning to any who might follow the path I have chosen. No treasure is worth a man's soul, and no amount of silver can buy peace for a conscience stained with innocent blood." I go to my death in the hope that my example will prevent others from making the choices that have brought me to this gallows. The executioner, a professional hangman brought in from Austin for the occasion, made the final adjustments to the noose and asked Elias if he had any last words. The condemned man shook his head and closed his eyes, seeming to murmur a silent prayer in the moments before the trapdoor was sprung. The hanging was carried out at exactly 10:45 a.m., and Elias Blackwood died instantly as his neck was broken by the force of the fall. Dr. Miles Peterson, the county physician, pronounced him dead after checking for a pulse and examining his eyes for signs of life. The body was left to hang for 15 minutes to ensure that death was complete, then cut down and placed in a simple wooden coffin made by the prison carpenter. The body of Elias Blackwood was buried in an unmarked grave in the town cemetery, attended only by Father Miguel and 2 grave diggers who had been paid to keep silent about the exact location of the burial. Local authorities feared the grave might become a shrine for those who admired his criminal exploits or a target for those seeking ghoulish souvenirs of his crimes. The wooden box containing the 3-5 human ears was destroyed in a ceremony attended by representatives of law enforcement agencies from across the West. Sheriff Kane personally lit the fire, and the assembled officials watched in silence as the gruesome trophies were consumed by flames until only ash and bone fragments remained. The ashes were then scattered in the Rio Grande, returning the remains of the victims to the land where many of their bodies had been disposed of by their killer. The destruction of the ear collection marked the end of the physical evidence of Elias Blackwood's crimes, but the psychological impact of his killing spree continued to echo through the region for decades afterward. The families who had lost loved ones to his violence struggled to find closure, and many never fully recovered from learning how their relatives had died. Sheriff Kane retired from law enforcement a year after Blackwood's execution, telling friends that the case had aged him and destroyed his faith in human nature. He remained in El Paso but lived a reclusive life, rarely leaving his ranch. He never spoke publicly about the investigation again, though he wrote a detailed memoir that was not published until after his death in 1895. The detailed confession notes and the trial transcript were sealed by court order and remained secret for more than 50 years, preventing the full story of the Rio Grande murders from becoming public knowledge until all the participants were dead. When the documents were finally released in 1912, they caused a sensation among criminologists and historians, who recognized them as one of the most complete records of serial murder in American legal history. Dr. Alistair Finch, the New Orleans physician who had testified about Elias's mental state, used the case as the basis for a groundbreaking study on criminal psychology published in 1865. His work established many of the principles that were later incorporated into modern forensic psychiatry and criminal profiling. The Blackwood case fundamentally changed law enforcement practices throughout the Wild West. It demonstrated the need for better communication between jurisdictions and led to the establishment of the Texas Rangers' first regional criminal identification systems. Sheriff's offices began to maintain detailed records of unsolved crimes and to share information with their counterparts in neighboring counties, practices that helped to solve many cases that might otherwise have remained mysteries. The methodical nature of Elias's record-keeping also influenced early studies of criminal behavior and contributed to the development of investigative techniques that are still used today. His detailed diaries provided insights into the mind of a serial killer that researchers had never had before, and his systematic approach to killing helped to establish patterns that investigators could look for in future cases. The Rio Grande region gradually healed from the trauma of the Blackwood years, but the scars left by his crimes never completely faded. The towns that had been terrorized by his presence slowly returned to normal life, but older residents continued to tell stories of the dark time when no one felt safe on the trails after sundown. Even today, more than a century and a half later, local people still speak in hushed tones of the man who collected human ears as trophies and turned a peaceful ranching community into a landscape of fear. Historical markers have been erected at some of the sites associated with his crimes, and the cave where he stored his ghastly collection has become a destination for those interested in the darker aspects of American history. The case of Elias Blackwood remains one of the most well-documented examples of serial murder in the history of American crime, a testament to both the evil that human beings are capable of and the determination of law enforcement officers to seek justice for the innocent victims of that evil. This mystery shows us the thin line between civilization and barbarism, and how quickly a person can shed their humanity in pursuit of wealth and power. It also demonstrates the importance of psychological understanding in criminal investigation and the need for society to remain vigilant against those who would prey on the innocent and defenseless. What do you think of this story? Do you believe Elias Blackwood's confessions revealed the full extent of his crimes? Or could there have been other victims whose remains were never discovered in the vast Texas desert? How do you think a case like this would be handled by modern law enforcement with today's forensic techniques? Leave your comments below and share your thoughts on this dark chapter in American criminal history. If you enjoyed this story and want more chilling tales like it, please subscribe, hit the notification bell, and share this with someone who loves a good mystery. Our channel is dedicated to bringing you the most chilling true crime stories from America's past. Tales that have been forgotten by time, but deserve to be remembered as warnings about the capacity for evil that exists in the human heart. See you in the next video.